Hello, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. Hope you're doing well. My name is Benjamin Hertz. I'm the Games in Schools course coordinator, and a very warm welcome to this second live event of the Games in Schools course on the European Schoolnet Academy and of the Games in Schools project. Great pleasure to have you all here today again. I hope many of you were with us at the first live event of the MOOC a couple of weeks ago and are very actively participating on the course. I think we have a very interesting program ahead of us with two really interesting speakers. One of them you already know, Gareth Cort, who's your course moderator. So you've been receiving emails from him. He's been in touch on the Facebook group and in the forums, etc. So he's going to be one of our key speakers, and then we'll have a second key speaker, also really interesting contribution to be expected from him, Dirk Bosmans, director of the PEGI Association. And I'll give an introduction to both of them in a moment. I just want to set a couple of ground rules for the webinar. As you've noticed, you cannot unmute yourself, you cannot activate your video at the moment. That will remain so for the duration of the webinar until we get to the Q&A session. But that doesn't mean you can't interact or ask questions or make comments. Please use the chat to do that. Get started, as some of you have already done, just to say hi, tell us where you're from. What's really nice to see is that there's been a lot of engagement already around this webinar on the course platform itself. So a lot of questions have been asked. We've noted down some of those questions. I don't think we'll be able to address all of them, but we did notice that there were also quite a lot of questions, not necessarily directly related to the course topic, but related to the course, not directly related to the webinar topic, but related to the course, and some also for the final assignment. So you can also ask those questions at the end, and we'll do our best to answer those as well. Yes, and then final quick word before we get started to just say that this webinar is being recorded, and the recording of it will be shared on the course and potentially beyond the course in the context of some dissemination activities. So if you have any objections to that, then this is the moment to leave the webinar. Yeah, great. I see we have Lisbeth also with us, and I see also some colleagues from ISFA, the Interactive Software Federation of Europe, which is the sponsor of the Games in Schools course and also this webinar. So welcome, everyone. And yeah, I think let's get started. Just a quick overview to say that yeah, this is our agenda for today. We'll get started with a presentation from Gareth, who will give an introduction to the safe use of games in schools, with a particular focus on safe use of games online in schools. And Gareth is an online safety consultant and a course moderator, as you know. He works for European Schoolnet, the coordinating body behind the Games in Schools project, as well as the UK Safer Internet Centre. And he also delivers education and awareness sessions to youth and adults across schools and youth centres. Gareth holds a bachelor's degree in psychology and is a qualified primary school teacher. So definitely knows what he's talking about. He knows what's happening on the ground in schools. Yeah, really looking forward to hearing what Gareth has to say about this topic. And then our second speaker will be Dirk Bosmans, who will talk about the role of PEGI and how PEGI can help your work with games in schools. PEGI is the Pan-European Game Information, which is like an age rating system that works across Europe for video games and apps. And Dirk oversees the continuous development of the PEGI system and works with national actors, governmental organizations, industry partners across Europe on raising awareness about video game culture, media literacy in general, and the age ratings in particular for games. So very much looking forward to also hearing his contribution here today to understand a bit more about how PEGI works and how all the PEGI resources can help you in the work in the classroom take the right decisions about what games are appropriate to use in your classroom with your students. So a very warm welcome to both of you again. And yeah, just to say then, once we have the two input presentations from Gareth and Dirk, we'll follow with a Q&A session. And as mentioned, then you will have the opportunity to ask questions. So you can also use your mic and your camera at that point in time. In the meantime, don't hesitate to ask any questions in the chat. Okay, great. And I see many of you are posting in the chat, telling us where you're from. We have people from Greece, Poland, North Macedonia, Romania, Belgium, USA. Excellent, Greece. Okay. So then I think without further ado, it's time to pass over to you, Gareth.
Brilliant. Thank you, Ben. Good afternoon, everyone. Lovely to see so many of you on the webinar today. Hi, Dirk, because I met Dirk a few months ago, so good to see Dirk again as well. So I'm just going to share my screen. So bear with me a moment, and it should hopefully pop up. There you go. So you should hopefully be able to see my Prezi slides. First thing to note is that you can get a copy of these slides either by typing in that short web address that you can see on the front slide, that bit.ly link, which is bit.ly/GIS 23 and then OS, which is just short for online safety. But you do have to make sure that that is all in capitals, that is case sensitive. Alternatively, if you've got a smartphone or a mobile device handy, you can just scan that QR code and get to it that way. And we will obviously pop it into the chat as well for you too. In fact, I think I can do it for you right now. There you go. Or Ben beat me to it. Okay, so this is I've only got about 20 minutes, so this is a bit of a whistle-stop tour. If I'm brutally honest, when I usually do webinars and things about online gaming and online safety, I usually have at least an hour, and even then I feel sometimes it doesn't do it justice. So we're going to kind of do a whistle-stop tour through a few different things to consider. It's about online safety risks around online gaming, and some of these are going to be definitely applicable to things you bring into the classroom as part of your educational practice. But also, there's the reality that online gaming exists outside of the classroom, and children and young people of all ages engage with that in many ways. So there are some risks in here that may only be pertinent to things that you consider when you're actually using it in education, but there are plenty of risks that exist, obviously, when it's outside of the classroom and in some ways out of your control. So I'm going to try and cover both in one go on this. And at the end, I'll also signpost to further information and advice about this topic that you can actually find on the Better Internet for Kids website that lets you allow to a chance to go into this in more detail. So bear with me. Lots of slides in this, but I'm not going to sort of stay on them for too long. It's really to kind of give you a taster, and obviously you've got reference to the slides afterwards too. First one, I think a really important one to set the scene around all of this, around online safety, is that gaming is big business. And if you're not sure how big business it is, go and have a look at ISFI's data from 2021. So I've just taken a few bits from that here on this slide, but some really interesting stats and infographics there about the growing player base of gamers around Europe. As you can see from this pie chart here, the way it's moving increasingly to mobile, and that has been the trend for a number of years, but also the legitimacy of esports in society in many European countries, and also some really interesting graphs and charts on different breakdowns by demographic and age and gender and things like that. So all really good stuff. But it is important to bear in mind that gaming is massive business and growing year on year. So if you have students in your classes of whatever age who have their heart set on becoming, an esports professional or working in the gaming industry, I think it's a great shout, because there are going to be so many jobs in so many different aspects of online gaming for many, many years to come, and they are definitely viable career options. So that's definitely one of the big boons, I think, of online gaming in the last few years, is it's creating lots of opportunities for young people to work in an area that they absolutely love and adore, and I think that's a fantastic thing. I'm very much going to be focusing, however, in this presentation on the potential risks that can come out of this. So I'm going to be focusing on three of the C's of risk that we tend to talk about, specifically content, contact, and conduct. I'm also going to kind of lump into conduct a little bit of commercialism and talk about things like loot boxes and stuff. So I'm just going to touch upon a few different areas and a few different thoughts throughout this that you might find useful. Depending on the age of your learners, some of these things are going to be more applicable than others. If you work with very young children, then some risks are going to be more apparent to them. If you're working with much older students, then different risks may come into play. It's very much context dependent. So we're going to start with content, the things you see in video games. And I'm not going to steal any of Dirk's thunder, because he's going to be talking about this in detail, because he works for PEGI. But this is the PEGI age rating system and content descriptors that you can see on the screen here. So they're in the slides there for reference, but I'm going to say no more on that, because Dirk's going to talk about that in more detail later. I'm going to focus on one of the more controversial or topical things that often crops up around content in video games, which is whether or not they cause or are related to violent behavior. And there are many amusing memes like the one you can see on the screen here out there on the internet, kind of poking a little bit of fun at this idea of actually, not all video games are violent, and indeed not all people who play violent video games are affected by it. And anecdotally, and with the children or young people you work with, you may have noticed behavior changes. You may have particular stories about children who have been affected by violent video games in a negative way. And there is a recognition that there is some kind of link there. But from an academic or research perspective, there's very little hard evidence to suggest a strong causal relationship between playing violent video games and then going and actually performing or acting out more violent behavior as a result. So just a couple of studies that point to that. One was from the University of York back in 2018, so in the UK, that very much supported the theory that violent video games don't make players more violent. And I think the language in that is quite important to pick up on. Just like other aspects of personality and individuals, some people are more violent than others naturally, but they didn't see any evidence in the studies and the review of studies that violent video games led to greater violence or greater changes in violent behavior. And that was also backed up by the American Psychological Association just before the start of the pandemic back in 2020. Actually, they were reaffirming their position that there is no causal link between playing violent video games and then acting more violently. It's not a simple cause and effect relationship. And you can see just from the tagline of this article, it's oversimplifying what is a very complex issue. So that's where a lot of the literature has stood for quite some time now. What I would say is as a primary school teacher myself, and having seen and heard things about children playing different types of video games outside of school, obviously, is that they are a form of media, and they are a form of art, actually, in many cases. And just like other forms of media and other forms of art, they have the potential to affect mood, emotions, particularly, sometimes make changes in behavior. And video games are no different. So there is the potential for violent video games to have a potentially negative impact on someone's mood or well-being or behavior. But there isn't a clear causal link between, say, playing Grand Theft Auto 5 and then going out and committing felons or crimes or anything like that. It's nothing as clear cut as that. And it's useful to be aware of, because parents often have sort of preconceived ideas about this. You as a teacher may have had some preconceived ideas about this, but we often view it as adults through a very different lens to the way children and young people view this issue. They just see video games of all different types as being a form of escapism or form of interaction with their friends and their peers, or way of achieving things or being competitive. They rarely associate violent video games with acting violently themselves. So it's a useful thing just to kind of be aware of, and take care not to oversimplify this kind of issue. That being said, though, of course, if you do have concerns about changes in a child's behavior, whether or not you think violent video games are causing it, more often than not, that's a sign that something's not quite right in that child's life. So if you do have child protection concerns or safeguarding concerns around the way that a child may be behaving in the classes that you teach or in the school that you work in, then of course, please do follow your child protection or safeguarding procedures in school to log that, to pass on your concerns to people who can take further action. As I said, behavior changes are more often or not a sign that something isn't quite right or something's going on in their lives, and getting to the bottom of that is one of the fastest ways to help them. But just going back to the content in video games, it is very much about age and understanding. So I'm sure Dirk will talk about it in a little while. The vast majority of video games out there rated under PEGI are largely for age 12 and under. There's a face, it's only around 25% that are kind of rated 16 and 18 that have the more violent content or the more adult themes. And so for children of different ages, they may be drawn to different things at different points. And sometimes it's the nature of things within those games that might draw them up as well. And of course, their understanding of the world around them can affect the type of games that they reach out for. So even though, a game may say that it's PEGI 12, there may be certain themes that may be suitable for some children that you work with and other children most definitely not. I think if you're using games in the classroom, you very much need to stick to the age rating. So it's not a good idea to be using sort of a PEGI 12 game for under 12s. I think you're going to end up with problems and maybe some parents who are upset by that. But be aware that not all games around that are necessarily created equal. And I'll give you an example of that in a moment. And that also fits in with this whole idea of different types of violence in video games. And the next slide will just give some context around that. I think as well, regardless of what games you may choose to bring into the classroom, you likely know that video game playing and game interactions are happening outside the classroom, and finding ways of bringing those experiences into the classroom and talking about those experiences with video games is a really fantastic way of talking about how to be safe online in general. If it's talking about the kind of people that you chat with, the type of things that people say in the game, the type of things you see and experience in the game, all of those discussions that you can have with children and young people of all different ages can be hugely valuable in helping impart, tips and advice and ideas around being safer online and making positive choices, and of course behaving in positive ways to other people that they're interacting with. And it is really about considering the wider context. You may work in a primary school and you may hear about younger children who have a knowledge of something like Grand Theft Auto 5 or Saints Row or Assassin's Creed, games that are aimed for a much older audience. But always be careful of the wider context. It may be that they haven't actually played these games firsthand, but they may have seen an older sibling playing it at home, or even a parent playing it at home, because their parents might be gamers as well. And it may be that they're aware of it, but they haven't interacted with it, sort of head on in the way that maybe you've thought. So always be wary, always ask questions, and talking about these experiences is a great way to further these discussions and find out more about the gaming habits of the children that you work with. And here's just an example of that context around violence in video games in general. Here's just a selection of games that carry a PEGI 12 rating in the case of Fortnite, or higher rating in the case of others like Star Wars Battlefront 2, that's PEGI 16, WWE I believe is PEGI 16, and Assassin's Creed Origins down in the bottom right is PEGI 18. And yet the themes within these games, we'll park Assassin's Creed for a minute, are themes that very much appeal to children below those ages. So, Fortnite is constantly bringing in Marvel characters and characters from all different aspects of media that children absolutely love, and that's something that might draw them towards those games. And while there is undoubtedly violence in Fortnite, there's no blood, there's no gore. It's very sort of cartoony. It's like playing with action figures almost in a sense. So you can kind of see why younger children are drawn to that. Similarly with things like Star Wars, if you love Star Wars films, you're going to be drawn to Star Wars games. And while there is undoubtedly violence in Battlefront and other Star Wars games that are higher age ratings, the type of violence is different to maybe some other violent video games that carry similar ratings. I'm sure Dirk will talk about this in more detail as well. And then things like WWE, which may appeal to younger children because they watch it on TV and would want to interact with it in a game. So I think it's important sometimes to consider the context around this violence. Is that yes, sometimes children are playing video games that are higher than their age, and those may be violent video games. But as you can see from some of the ones on the screen here, the nature of the violence may be very different to other more violent video games that carry the same age certification. The last one though, Assassin's Creed, is an interesting one because you can actually find ways of getting games like that into the classroom. So some of the more recent Assassin's Creed games do actually have sort of virtual tour modes that you can use where it strips out all the violent content, and it's very much a case of interacting with the game world to showcase the stunning landscapes and the historical features of the time period that's featured in those games. So Assassin's Creed Origin is set in Egyptian times, and it's a great way of learning about Egyptian history through the virtual tour mode in that game. So sometimes games that on the first glance don't look particularly appropriate may have certain features in them that enable you to use them in the classroom in a more content appropriate way. So that's content. Moving swiftly on to contact, and this is one to consider for any games that you bring into the classroom that allow communication with other players in the game, but also good to be aware of for the games that children play outside of the classroom as well. And it all hinges around this whole idea of stranger danger, which 10 years ago used to be a valid message online. You could say, right, children, don't chat with people you don't know in games, only chat to friends, only chat to family, only add them to your contact lists. But in 2023, it's a completely different landscape. And I think the pandemic fast forwarded a lot of this through lockdowns as well. The fact that increasingly children and young people of all ages are engaging with online gaming experiences or platforms or ecosystems that throw them into online spaces with people they don't know, complete strangers. And for many of them, for most of the time, these are hugely positive experiences as well. They get to practice working as part of a team, they get to refine their communication skills, they get to problem solve or employ logical thinking. They get to meet people who love the same games as them and be able to chat about those in game. So increasingly, there are lots of opportunities where children, through no fault of their own, are thrown into online spaces with people they don't know. And actually, this whole idea of don't talk to strangers then falls down very quickly, because if you don't interact with someone who's part of a team, it's quite hard to complete the task or to win. In fact, you may be doing a disservice to other people you're playing with if you don't communicate and interact with them, because that's what the game kind of needs to help you achieve an objective or a victory. And even things like, games like Among Us, the whole idea is actually to interact with each other to try to get to the bottom of who the imposter is, who the murderer is in the game. It's also a game that's also about lying. So you've got this fascinating dynamic of being thrown maybe into a lobby with people you don't know, who are also then, explicitly on purpose not telling the truth, because that's the aim of the game. So you have all these interesting dynamics around trust and around relationships that go on underpinning this. So it's a case of not saying don't talk to strangers, but more pivoting the message towards, yes, you might be talking to strangers. What do you need to be aware of? What things do you need to do to keep yourself and others safe? Because this whole idea of just never talking to strangers online is now falling down a lot in video games. So it's about enabling children to engage with this in a more positive and safe way. And why is this important? Well, this is a stat from the UK, but largely indicative of other EU countries, I imagine, and other European countries too, is that increasingly people are meeting each other and forming relationships of all kinds online. That's kind of what technology has enabled. And so increasingly that's going to be the case in the future as well. And again, the pandemic probably fast forwarded this stat dramatically too. So it is becoming more normal to start relationships or friendships online with people that you interact with through shared hobbies and interests, just as you would do if you kind of did a hobby or interest offline. You might meet someone who shares that as well and you become friends. So it's important to have nuance around this message. Yes, it's someone you don't know. Yes, you do need to be wary of that, but you also need to be aware that actually there's a lot to be gained from engaging in these relationships as well. The one thing that obviously does worry us as adults who work with children is, of course, when there are predatory adults who may seek to actually abuse children or harm children online. And so this doesn't just happen in games, this happens in any online space where children and young people interact. And sometimes having an awareness of this and helping children understand some of this process around how this kind of approach works can be useful in protecting them too. So if someone's seeking to abuse a child online, they will target multiple children all at once. They will seek out as much personal information as they can, because it's easier to strike up a conversation with someone if you know a bit more about them. If they've shared certain things on social media about their likes and their interests, that's easier to strike up a conversation. Oh, you support Barcelona, or you love My Little Pony. It's an easier way in to open that door of opportunity. They will often be truthful about the fact that they're an adult. They will sometimes pretend to be a child online, but not always. They will more often prey on the fact that the most vulnerable children, vulnerable to a grooming or predatory approach, tend to be children who don't have strong, stable adult role models in their life keeping them safe. And those are the children that these type of people prey on first of all. They often introduce sexual language and themes wherever they may be, in game chat or social media or other places, because they're testing for a reaction. And if the reaction they get from a child is a positive or a curious reaction around sexual themes, then they kind of know that there's an opportunity there to potentially exploit them further. So they constantly test vulnerabilities, and they either advance the process if they're having luck, or they back off if they're finding that they're not having any luck at all. As I mentioned, it happens anywhere online that children go, in the same way that, if someone were to target children offline, they would go where children are: schools, parks, playgrounds, places of that nature. So that's useful to bear in mind. It's not that games are any worse a place for these type of people to try to target children. It's the fact that just lots of children play games. So that's where these people would go. One really useful message that's good to convey to your students is that when you're chatting to someone that you've just met online and they seem like your new best friend and you're having a great time, sometimes it's the public private test. If you're suddenly chatting in a public space in a game and it's all going well, and then suddenly they want you to move to a very private one-on-one chat quite quickly, always be wary of the reasons around that. Are they just trying to be your new best friend and they just want to take the chat further? Or are they trying to move you to a private space where they can more easily manipulate you, where other people aren't going to see it happening? And more often than not, if they're trying to move you quickly to that kind of space, it is the latter. It's someone who's trying to exploit you. So sometimes just being aware of these kind of things can help protect children so that they can interact in a more positive way in these games. Of course, there's other type of conduct that appears in these games in terms of the way that people treat each other. So there's things such as hate speech, and the platforms are increasingly trying to take steps to find ways of manage that or identify that when it's seen. And of course, other things around sort of online bullying and sort of stalking type behavior or harassing behavior. A couple of resources that can be really useful to help explore these, not directly through games, but games do obviously feature throughout these resources, is the Selma Hacking Hate project, which allows you to explore the nature of hate speech in all its different forms and how young people can actually counter that hate speech online, be it on social media or in games. And also the Kid Actions project on cyberbullying has got a number of activities for exploring the nature of cyberbullying, both in games and other online spaces. And again, equipping children and young people with skills to identify and challenge that kind of behavior too. And full disclosure, I was involved in the development of both of these resources. So I'm biased, but I think they're great. But they are well worth exploring to talk about these tricky areas. And sorry, I'll just skip through these couple of slides, but the Selma one very much focuses on social and emotional awareness, and that's a really useful one to help explore with children, to help them understand, again, that games and experiences in games are affective. They affect your mood, and your mood can affect your behavior and your choices, both positively and negatively. So the Selma project makes strong use of this mood meter that you can see on the screen here of different emotional states. In terms of online bullying, it's also about encouraging positive and respectful behavior for children when they're interacting with others through games, either games that you're using in the classroom where they may be chatting to each other, or games they may be playing outside where they're playing with other people, such as friends, family, or strangers. It's about never retaliating to a bully because that's what they want. Don't give them the reaction. Rather, save the evidence through screenshots or video captures or saving chat logs. Use the tools that are available in the game to help manage this, report players who are abusive, block them wherever you can, and always make sure they let someone else know about it, such as a trusted adult, so further action can be taken. And then lastly, very quickly, conduct. So, conduct is a huge area in terms of how people behave in video games, but actually both the protection of personal information and the developing of a positive online reputation, whether they're playing as themselves or as a persona in a game, can have huge benefits for staying safe online. If you have a good standing in an online game, it can be very protective against people trying to exploit you, such as online predators, but it can also help protect you against things like bullying as well. If you have a good standing in an online gaming group or an online gaming space, if someone does try to attack or target you, you find very quickly that people close ranks, the community comes together around you to protect you. So these can be hugely protective factors as well. But very, very quickly, just on the topic of conduct, one really interesting one that is constantly in flux at the moment is this whole idea of loot boxes and how they relate to gambling. So there's a number of more recent research articles here on the screen from different countries about whether loot boxes are directly related to gambling, and increasingly the evidence suggests yes, they are. They are very akin to gambling, and a number of European countries have already taken steps to actually ban loot boxes and these types of in-app purchases in games because they are encouraging gambling behavior. And it's also sometimes, if you want to bring some mathematics into this, it's another way you can get games and maths together in school and in the classroom. Look at the statistics around loot boxes. So this is just this is from the School Social Networks, another project I was involved on a couple of years ago with resources for primary teachers and also parents of primary age children. And it's just explaining the difference between what less than 1% means as a term. So if you want to pull the best players on FIFA for your ultimate team, you have a less than 1% chance in your loot box of getting one of those. But of course, depending on which end we're talking of less than 1%, so is it closer to zero? Is it closer to 1%? You can see on the screen here the number of boxes you would have to open to guarantee you get one of those star players. And it shows, even at the top end of less than 1%, you're still looking at anywhere between 230 to 460 boxes. At the lower end, we're looking at, hundreds of thousands of boxes. So sometimes the way these things, these in-app purchases of buying extra characters or skins or features are sold can be very enticing, and children might want to spend their own money on this or their parents' money to try and get the rarest things. But sometimes just having a look at the statistics underpinning that can be really handy to help them understand that, yes, it could be fun to buy some of these things from time to time, but don't go in with the expectation you're going to get the rarest stuff, because the odds are very heavily stacked against you, just as they are in many gambling contexts, such as casinos. So that's a useful one to explore. The other interesting one is this whole idea around addiction. So back in 2018, the World Health Organization classified gaming disorder as a mental health condition. It sits under two diagnoses manuals. So under ICD-11, this is how they characterize gaming disorder. And I won't read that out. That's on the slides there for you. But you do need to have evidence of these behavior changes for at least 12 months. And then under the proposed DSM-5 symptoms, all these different types of things here. And I'd actually say a lot of these things, if you're seeing these types of behavior changes in a child, again, you may not know it's related to problematic gaming or addicted to gaming. Could actually be other things that are causing problems in their lives that may produce these types of behavior changes as well. So being on the lookout for changes in behavior in your students is a really important thing, I think, when it comes to their safety and well-being online. The problem with this, just as the problem with things like violent video games, is that there is no cause and effect around this. So a study from a few years ago had a look at different studies around internet gaming disorder, and they found that firstly, people couldn't agree on what this actually was. So there are huge differences in terms of the definition. And one meta-analysis that they did found that only around 3% of people who play video games are actually at risk of developing addiction. So just like other types of addiction, people can engage with certain behaviors and certain types of substances and not become addicted to them, but there is always a small percentage of people who can, and that includes video games and young people as well. So we have to be wary of how we use this term addiction. Sometimes problematic gaming is gaming that actually is okay because a child likes it and it's their hobby, but it's actually the adults around them who don't condone it or think it's a good use of their time, maybe because it's just for fun rather than for education. So be wary about how you talk about this kind of stuff around addiction as well. There's also, I won't go into this too much detail, but actually there's reasons why people like to play games. They actually give them a lot of fulfillment that sometimes they're not getting in their offline lives around autonomy, competence, and relatedness. And there has been research into this as well that kind of suggests that actually for some people, they get a lot of life satisfaction out of what they can achieve in games through being competitive, through having free choice, through actually being able to achieve and attain things. And that can sometimes meet the needs that more traditionally are met through other aspects of offline life, such as, getting a good job or buying a house or starting a family, for adults at least. Some of these things are met through video games, and some people are happy meeting those needs through video games. So not everyone is the same, and that's an important takeaway as well. And in some cases, although rare, it's actually correlated with positive well-being as well. So certain types of games tend to come into the mix on this, but there are games that can actually enhance well-being rather than cause damage to it too. The other side of this as well is the problematic gaming, and the need to constantly stay with things and games and stay glued to a screen tends to be caused through persuasive design, which preys on the body's and the brain's ability to produce dopamine, which can lead to all of these different types of things. I'm not going to go into detail on these because it will take about another hour just to explain these, but there are lots and lots of features both in social media platforms and many online free-to-play mobile games that are designed to keep people hooked and keep people looking at a screen for longer. Why? Because you can show them more adverts. A couple of great resources you can check out to explore this further with your students. One is the Centre for Humane Technology. They've got a great toolkit on how to explore this further. And also this brilliant website that I only found recently called Dark Patterns that actually highlights these different types of persuasive design features in games that may encourage people to spend more money or spend more time in a game. They also highlight games that don't do that as well. So you can look out for the best ones that you might be able to use in the classroom that don't run the risk of creating these kind of behavior changes as well. And then there's other emerging risks that I won't even go into today, things that I think are to kind of put a bookmark in and come back to. The fact that the metaverse might play a part in this. Artificial intelligence has been in the news a lot the last 6 months. How will that affect the games that children play in the future and their interactions on those? We're not quite sure yet. And then a lot of increasingly, and this is one to watch out for actually, NFT-based games coming out. So games where you can buy things in the game that hold no actual tangible physical value, but hold value within the game. And that might introduce children to other sort of commercial concepts they haven't been used to. And then what effect does playing video games have 30, 40 years down the line? We're not quite sure yet. Hopefully a positive one, because I love games, as I'm sure many of you on the call do as well, but we don't necessarily know. So it's an issue that's in constant flux. I've done a very, very quick snapshot of a lot of different things in there, and I appreciate there's an information overload, but you can check out on our Better Internet for Kids website our Teacher Corner, which has self-directed learning modules that you can work through on different types of online safety risks. And within the deep dive section, although it's not live just yet, hopefully we'll be live this week, next week, we do actually have a specific deep dive topic on online gaming that explores all of these risks that I've talked about further, and some additional ones as well. And you can also see things like cyberbullying are explored in more detail there too. And that brings us to the end. I appreciate I've talked very quickly and thrown a lot at you, but you've got the slides, and do feel free to reach out to me anytime afterwards. Very happy to answer questions about this area. And thanks so much for your time today. Thank you.
Many thanks, Gareth. And appreciate that you had to do a quick rundown there. But I think it's really important to really get an overview and introduction to all these different topics, themes, and resources. And as you said, this is a stepping stone for the colleagues on the call to then go and find those resources that you flagged up and to investigate further on the topics that you've addressed. Some of those are also picked up in the videos from Ollie in the MOOC directly, so in Module 5. So probably many of you have not fully yet gone through Module 5 of the course, so you'll also have an opportunity to pick up a lot of that throughout the rest of the module that's currently going on the course. But yeah, Gareth remains here with us. He's just posted us his email address as well, and we'll have some time during the Q&A session. But let's make sure we also give enough time to our second speaker, Dirk Bosmans, director of PEGI, and who will go into a bit more details to some of the aspect that Gareth has already mentioned in regards to the age rating systems around games. So thanks again, Dirk, for joining us today. And yeah, floor is yours.
All right. Thank you very much. I'm very honored to be a speaker on this event today. I've started sharing my screen. I hope you can see this. Can you confirm that, Benjamin?
Yes, I can see your entire PowerPoint window. So it's not in presentation. Yeah, now it's in presentation. Excellent.
There I am. All right. So what I normally tend to do is teachers are not necessarily our primary audience. PEGI is designed to inform parents, but also gatekeepers, within which I include teachers, about video games. And so my traditional slides, I've tried to take the teacher perspective as much as possible. As you said, Benjamin, some of the things that I will be talking about today, you will also see in Ollie Bray's video, and I will, just like Gareth sort of touched upon my topic, I will come closely to some of the things that he has said as well, so we get multiple opportunities to touch upon these things. But now I'm going to focus a little bit about PEGI, Pan-European Game Information. Basically, it's designed to be very simple. We provide information to parents and gatekeepers about the minimum recommended age for a game. If a game has a PEGI 16, we say it's not appropriate for children below the age of 16. We say not appropriate. And this is my first link to what Gareth explained. We used to start by saying that the game might be harmful below the age of 16, but with the progressing academic insights, for example, into the potential impact of violence, we, more than a decade ago, pivoted our narrative towards inappropriate, because even though there is no evidence that violence in a video game has no immediate harmful effect on children, we very quickly noticed that parents still found this information useful. The fact that it doesn't harm your child doesn't mean it's appropriate for your child. So this information remained relevant, just with a slightly different angle. We provide some extra information about the minimum recommended age by adding content descriptors that explain a little bit about the reason why a specific age rating was given. So if a game has PEGI 12 with violence and bad language, those are the two elements that you will find in the content that have caused this 12 rating. If there are no content descriptors, it has a PEGI 3 rating. These icons, you only will find these on physical packaging, on boxes, which is a shrinking market. These days, a lot is digital only and online, and you will see that a lot of storefronts have in fact kept the age labels, but have switched swapped the content descriptors for text descriptors, which has one big advantage, or in fact two advantages. It can be described in the local language, which makes it easier for people to understand, and it adds a little bit of more detail. So with 18, it will say extreme violence. With 12, it will say minor violence, for example. So they're designed to be simple and universally understandable, and they're based on psychological assessment and in accordance with existing standards. We did not really invent this. There were movie classification systems long before PEGI started, and we're celebrating 20 years now. So we can actually look back at a few decades of content classification expertise, specifically designed for nonlinear media. What does this mean? If one level in a game contains some very strong violence, we cannot ignore it in the context of the entire game, because if you're not very good at it, like me, for example, I will have to replay that level 75 times, which means I see that type of violence 75 times. Therefore, we do not take the context of the rest of the game into account. Anything can trigger an H rating. We also do update these following technological, academic, and societal developments, and sometimes, doesn't happen very often, we add something. For example, the in-game purchases icon was added in 2018 when we saw that in-game purchases were becoming a significant part of the market, and lots of parents had questions about this. Now, in the context of that, some of the things that are good to know. PEGI ratings are never different per country. We give a game the same rating from Portugal to Finland and from Iceland to Greece and everything in between. If a PEGI rating for a game title is different per platform, it simply means that there is a difference. This is extremely rare, but you sometimes see, or actually these days it's less common, that a console version, for example, the Xbox version has a PEGI 18, but there is also a mobile version which doesn't have all the technical bits that you will find on the console version, and therefore sometimes some of the most extreme content is not available, and then the same game will have a PEGI 16. But for us, from a content rating perspective, technically, that's a different game. We also do not censor games, but if companies come to us and say, like, we have a PEGI 16 now, but we really aim for a younger audience, how do we do this? It may be their choice to change or remove some of the content. We do not interfere in all of this. Whatever stuff they send us, and it can be quite strong stuff, sometimes we give it a rating. We also do not ban games, but this may happen if a storefront decides that some of the content that they see come through their platform does not meet their standards, and local authorities may actually have laws against certain content, but it is extremely, extremely rare. I will give some statistics later that will show you that the large majority of the video games is actually appropriate for almost everyone. Very important also to understand and to avoid some confusion is that we consider the age suitability of the content of the game. But these days there are other age indicators in relationships to games that we cannot mix in with a PEGI rating. For example, sometimes it says you need to be 13 according to the GDPR regulation to sign up for an online account, which you need in order to play this game. That 13 tells you nothing about the video game content. In fact, that video game could be PEGI 7. And we need to see how this new data protection regulation spins out in the coming years, whether this 13 still means that a parent can allow a child to make an online account, or that a parent can make an online account for that child. But that 13 is sometimes confusing because they go like, how can the game be PEGI 7 and 13 at the same time? We also do not include the likely or the unlikely behavior that other players may display or the content that they may upload. And this is a growing part of the video games industry. As Gareth already said, it's a hyper-social environment these days, but the degree to which players are invited to create their own content is growing very fast. And that type of user-generated content is obviously something that we have never been able to see when we gave the age rating to a specific video game. So we always now include the notice that user-generated content needs to be assessed independently from that. And the last one is a very old one. We do not include the level of difficulty. PEGI does not mean the level of difficulty like you see age indicators on board games, for example. We inform about the content, but that doesn't mean it always is the intended audience. And the best example that I always give is the oldie but goldie Microsoft Flight Simulator, which is PEGI 3. I do not see a lot of 5-year-olds playing Microsoft Flight Simulator in the expert mode. In fact, you know, it's like a pilot training. Some of the 3 and 7 games are not necessarily suitable for young children. They may be too difficult. PEGI 16 and 18 games, on the other hand, even though they might be very easy and any kid could play them, they are always for an older audience. So in the higher age categories, target audience and PEGI rating are similar. Now, one of the questions that was raised, like, how do these games get an age rating? How does PEGI decide whether a game is 7 or 12? In fact, we have 2 procedures to do this. One is the old traditional method. If a game is being released on a disc and distributed all across Europe, we need to see this game and examine it before it is actually being physically distributed. And also big online titles, big digital titles that want to be absolutely sure that they know the age rating before they release it on the market, they use this pre-release method. And it starts with the signature on a contract. The PEGI Code of Conduct is where it starts. It's where a company agrees to follow the rules that PEGI has described in the Code of Conduct. It also means that if they don't follow the rules, we can actually enforce a penalty. We don't have to do that very often, but it is important to make this self-regulatory model, because PEGI was founded by the video games industry, credible and workable. It needs to be the best possible solution out there. Once they've become a PEGI signatory, they start by answering the questions in the PEGI questionnaire in our online system. Literally, yes or no question. Does your game have violence? No. Proceed to the next question. If you answer yes, then we have a follow-up question. Is this violence against human characters or fantasy characters? Is this violence realistic or is it non-realistic? And we basically create a flow chart through which at some point we will have a pretty good idea, if the publisher is answering these questions honestly, what the rating is going to be. So at the end of that process, they already get what we call a provisional rating, because sometimes games are marketed months before they are released on the in stores, and we want at least consumers to be already informed about what is likely going to be the age rating. But then still some work is on the shelf for us, because the publisher will then send the content complete game to our independent administrators for further examination. And NICAM and the VSC Rating Board in the United Kingdom are the 2 institutions that we've been working with for 20 years. The NICAM Institute in the Netherlands is also renowned for their film and TV classification system Kijkwijzer. And the Video Standards Council Rating Board in the United Kingdom has also been assisting us with the examinations since the very start. They actually play the game for a couple of hours to ensure that the rating that was gotten by answering the questionnaire is accurate. And if they have questions, they can interact with the publisher and see if something is wrong. So in 1 in 4 cases, in fact, this provisional rating gets corrected, and they say that was not a 12. What we saw was actually PEGI 16 level violence, so that is the final rating. Once they get the final rating, the publisher can release the game on the European markets. And it's currently grayed out, but we have a second procedure, but I'll come back to that in a second. Once they have this age rating, you will see that the age label will go on the front of the package and on the back of the package, accompanied by the content descriptors. In digital storefronts, the PEGI age rating information is always available next to the buy button, because we want parents and players to be informed about the age rating before they make the decision to buy a game. So to give you an example, violence is the most common type of content that triggers a specific rating. We have sort of a matrix of different types of violence, and depending on how strong or how mild the violence is, a game will end up in a specific category. And you will see that on the PEGI 3 level, very pixelated or very abstract violence, shooting soap bubbles at another square-shaped character is not triggering a specific age rating. At the other end of the scale, you see some very gross violence against humans. We have criteria like sexual violence against defenseless characters, which is in fact something that we never see. But we still think it is important to have that criterion in place should ever someone have the idea to include that type of violence in a video game. We at least lock it behind an 18 rating. But in most of those cases, in the most extreme cases, the platforms that offer games to players also have rules in place that will not make those games possible for release. Just on the other end, you will see that where 6 in 10 games will feature some sort of violence, only 3 to 4% of all the games that we see on an annual basis contain sex. Although we have a content descriptor for it, it's actually extremely rare. Sexual content or themes are not very useful for video games, where it's often literally the purpose to beat your opponent, literally. But we do have sexual descriptions or posturing at PEGI 12, going to the more explicit interaction at PEGI 18. Just for clarification, I looked up the recent statistics, and as you see here, 61 at the top right, 61.5% of all the games that were classified by PEGI in 2022 had some sort of violence. But in fact, of the 1,076 games, more than 1/5 actually only had very mild PEGI 7 violence, and only 184, what is that, around 8%, has PEGI 18 level violence. The second most common category is bad language. Something, you only need one word to trigger this criterion, so it's very quickly attained by a video game. Fear and horror, spread out between 7 and 16, is the third common category. And then, as I said, you will see that topics like sex, drugs, or alcohol, or the simulation of gambling are quite rare in video games these days. They do occur. 1.3% of games still accounts for 48 games on an annual basis. But I hope this also gives you the view that even though some of the more inappropriate types of content in video games often catch the headlines, it's the bloodiest video games or the games with the most provocative content, you see that there is quite a large offering of video games in the PEGI 3 and the PEGI 7 and the PEGI 12 category that don't have any of these themes. It's not that there is a lack of choice these days on the market. In-game purchases appears on all the age ratings, and quite surprisingly, maybe only just over 1 in 5 games have in-game purchases. It's very widely discussed these days, but it's very important to know that almost 4 out of 5 games that we classify actually do not offer in-game purchases. So also there, if parents do not like the fact that children have the ability to spend money, there are alternatives. Of those 386 games that last year had in-game purchases, 48 games had paid random items, which are in fact loot boxes or card packs. It's less than 3%, although there's a lot of discussion around this. We don't see them very often. Mind you, very important, this does not include the mobile market, where the numbers might be somewhat different. But I thought this gives you some perspective on where the violence and other content is distributed across the age categories. Briefly about the post-release method. This is something that we had to develop because mobile and digital games are a vast new market that only came about in the last 10 years, which may seem like a long time ago, but actually it's not that long ago. Digital-only games these days need more flexibility because we're talking about numbers that is much bigger than the 2,000 games that we see approximately for the pre-release method. So the publisher submits their game for release on a digital platform like Xbox or Google Play, for example, and then they are brought to a questionnaire that looks a lot like the PEGI questionnaire. The thing is, at the end of that questionnaire, they get a PEGI rating, but they also get a rating for the USK system in Germany, the ESRB system in North America, Brazil, Australia, South Korea. It's expanding. It's like a one-stop shop for age classifications in the world. And then immediately, because it's a digital, very fast-moving system, the game is already released in European markets and beyond with an H rating. We will still go in and examine games to make changes if necessary. Because there is no physical product, it only takes one click of a button to change the PEGI 18 into a PEGI 12 or a PEGI 16. And if individual players report an issue with an H rating, we can very quickly do an additional examination and change the rating in the blink of an eye. There is an exclamation mark label there that I didn't show on my first slide, and it's because it actually does not apply to video games. You will only find that exclamation mark label for games, for applications like Spotify or YouTube, where there is a wide offering of different content. So that means that it's basically a warning signal to parents, like, we cannot give this an H rating because 18 wouldn't work and 3 wouldn't work. Please pay attention. Who uses PEGI? Well, Xbox, PlayStation, and Nintendo are traditional ones. Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt you. Just a bit aware of time. I think looking at the slides, do you think it would be possible to skip forward to the parental control tools or the messages part? I think just so that we still at least have a little bit of time for some questions at the end. Yeah. Sorry about that.
One main point that I want to make with this slide is that everything within that circle has PEGI ratings, but Roblox, Apple, and Steam do not. And I think that's important to note, because lots of children will talk to their parents about and their teachers about games they play on Steam. Steam does not provide age labels to video games, which means that parents and teachers need to pay attention. There is no information necessarily available. Apple does not use PEGI, but has its own H rating system, which is something else. And Roblox is a very developing user-generated content system where also some caution is required, because these are amateur-made games, professionally made games, all mixed together, and there are no H ratings. They're starting to develop an H rating system, but it needs some time to develop. This is the map. That we'll see that on the slides. This is actually what Gareth talked about. PEGI takes care of the content. The context is basically the contact and the conduct topics that Gareth discussed. These are questions that are important to parents today that we cannot put in an H rating. Whether a kid should be spending money is not something that should be locked behind an H label. So parental control tools are a very important instrument there. And these things may actually be interesting for players, so for students themselves as well. If students struggle to put a stop to their video games because they need to study, they actually might self-apply a time limit using these applications that allow them to say, today I will be playing 90 minutes, but no longer. And for younger children, most of the time, the parents will effectively appreciate having a tool like this. And so this is the core message that we usually give to parents, players and parents. But I'm going to skip to the next one because I tried to rewrite this from the perspective of teachers. We encourage teachers to have a dialogue with their pupils about games. Children love to talk about games, why they like it and what they play. Having that conversation can be a good lesson to discuss general rules about, for example, online contact and online conduct, or about how much time they want to play, what sort of content they may see, whether it's rated or unrated or user-generated, and how they interact online with each other. Because obviously, because it's a hyper-social environment, their emotions will run wild. If children struggle with these matters, video game platforms offer useful tools to report, monitor, and manage. And that increases the understanding of teachers and it reduces the risks for children. So having games as one of their hobbies can be an instrument in an educational context. Now, if you need more information or resources about PEGI, our website is available in 25 languages, and we have a PEGI app, which gives you access to most of the H rating database that we have. It doesn't include everything, for example, from Google Play, but Google Play in itself, obviously, is a database too, and it's available in 9 languages. So these apps, these links are available if you need some more information. Sorry, Benjamin, for going a bit over time, but I hope this was useful.
I think it was very useful. Many, many thanks, Dirk. I mean, I think, again, a plethora of key information that is useful for teachers to take important decisions when using games in their classroom. And yeah, I mean, I think we were generally a bit behind schedule, so this wasn't your fault at all. I just want to make sure we still pick up maybe 1 or 2 questions from the audience. And there's also one, I think, element that's come out of the questions addressed by the questions that we found on the Padlet in the course, which were published before this webinar. And I think it's relevant for both Gareth and you, Dirk, and that is in a way to talk a bit more about the role of parents and how to work with parents. There were quite a few questions on the Padlet that were referring to parents. How can parents be involved? How can parents be sort of convinced of the educational value that games can have? Because as both of you are referring to, I mean, there is still this prevalent opinion amongst many parts of the society that video games are extremely violent or have negative effects on young people, and so I'm wondering what experience do you have of talking to teachers or working with teachers on how they talk to the parents? How do they convince parents? And I'm sure a lot of the resources that you've mentioned can be part of that conversation, but I wonder if there's anything that you can say on that, sort of how can teachers trigger that conversation? How should they go about that? And yeah, anyone want to go first on that, or?
I can dive in on that one. So
yeah, great, thanks.
Yeah, it is tricky, and invariably, I think for many teachers, you may not, unless you're talking about games regularly in the classroom anyway, you may not come across having to have this conversation with parents until something's gone wrong. So it's a case that a child has started talking about playing a really inappropriate game and they've been talking to their friends in the classroom, and you hear about it, and then you've got concerns, or a child's behavior changes in some way and you have concerns. But I think it's like most other things with online safety, it's small regular conversations tend to be the best ones. And I know, Dirk, in fact, when I saw you speak about 6 months ago, Dirk, you talked about the importance of almost normalizing these conversations to the point that they're mundane. You know, talking about games shouldn't be a novelty. It should just be sort of an everyday thing, because it is an everyday part of children's lives. So I think small and often is the best. And for schools, so many schools sometimes that I see, particularly in the UK, will wait until like they can have a parents' evening to try and get lots of parents in to talk about games and online safety, when actually they send out a newsletter and they have like a Twitter feed that they're using all the time, but they're not sending any messages out that way. So I think sometimes that little and often tidbits of advice and tips and things on a regular basis helps normalize all of these conversations. And my advice for parents usually is the case of, if you don't really kind of understand why your child loves gaming, what they're doing on it, is get involved and sit down and play the games with your child and get an awareness of why they love it. Why do they love playing Minecraft? What is it about the games they play on Roblox that they truly adore? And until you sit down and do that, you can never have that understanding. And I think for us as educators, we sometimes forget that too. If the children in your class love a certain game, sit down and have a go at it sometime and find out why they love it. It gives you so much insight into so many different things and allows you to support them better.
And that's the message that a teacher can bring to parents. Like, parents, take an interest in the hobby that your child apparently loves so much, but you will always have this range of parents that are involved and parents that are not at all involved. And as a teacher, you obviously need to navigate the entire range. The best way, I guess, to approach this is to be familiar with video games yourself. And if that is not the case, I would recommend to teachers what I would recommend to parents: invite those experts you have in the room who may be, if they're 16, very bored and tired and hormonal, and it's not necessarily going to be easy, but at least give them a chance to let them talk about something that they are very passionate about. They will teach you a lot about these things, and it will go very fast. But if you're more familiar with video games, it will be easier for you to speak with confidence to parents who are like, oh, my kid is playing video games, it's all going to go wrong. then you can say, like, look, this does not necessarily have to be a bad thing. There are a few parameters to take into account. As a teacher, I would hope, and it's obviously, unfortunately, not always the case, but that you can speak with some authority when it comes to their children. And like I said, it is very different because you have a mixed group here. It's very different if you speak to parents and teachers of 6 to 8-year-olds or 15 to 17-year-olds. 15 to 17-year-olds, maybe some of those conversations are too late, but especially in the primary school, have that conversation. It's literally like I started it with my 2 children, and I'm now noticing, now that they're growing into their adolescence, that some of the conversations are getting a bit tricky, and it's less of a conversation, but more of a fight. But I guess that's how education and raising children works.
Many thanks, and I love that point, Dirk. Yeah, I mean, make use of the experts in the room. Those are the children. So, yeah, excellent. Okay, just wondering if there are any direct questions from the colleagues who are here in this meeting. Please do write in the chat if you have any questions or any comments. You can also raise your hand, and I will give you a presenter right, so you can unmute yourself. Don't hesitate. Don't be shy. There were many different questions on the Padlet, so I know there are questions out there for sure.
Benjamin, I just see you post the Taming Gaming link, because indeed, and while people may be posting a question, I saw that there were lots of questions about what is a good game to teach physics, or what's a good game for younger children. That information is obviously not something that PEGI necessarily gives in its entirety. It will tell you if a game is not suitable, but a game that may have the right age rating may still not necessarily be suitable for a very specific task. And that's where Taming Gaming can be indeed an interesting database, because they have diverse lists, educational games, games that use mathematics, games that use history, exploration. And I would say that there are 2 interesting sources for that. One is Taming Gaming, and other sites like that will literally review individual games that have a good educational purpose. But I would say that a large network of teachers that have experience with using video games in a teaching context is the second best tip that I would give. It's obviously not something that I can bundle in a website URL, but the grassroots organization, hearing other teachers talk about what works is often a very good tool as well. And I guess the Games in Schools network is very useful in that context. So thank you for that.
Indeed, many thanks. And a ton of resources out there, also those mentioned by Gareth on the Better Internet for Kids website. And I see there's a question now coming in here from Marizona Sven. Have there been recent examples of like popular console games that released without a PEGI rating? Is it a negligible number?
It is negligible because it is 0. And that's because the console manufacturers, Microsoft, Sony, and Nintendo, make a PEGI rating mandatory. You cannot release a game on Xbox or PlayStation without a PEGI rating. You can do that on Steam. So when you go on Steam, you will find also some pretty popular titles that will not have a PEGI rating. And that's the problem with self-regulation, as in the ones who join and participate make sure it works very well. We've reached out to Valve, the company behind the Steam platform. So far, they've been unwilling. Apple has a different approach. They go like, what we do ourselves is something we can do better. That's also good. You don't have to join PEGI, just copy PEGI. But so on console games, you have possibly the best curated platforms out there in terms of minor protection, I guess also quality control, which is not to say that some really good quality games can be found on Steam. It's just, it's in the middle of lots of other stuff that I would not necessarily recommend.
Yeah, and many thanks for flagging that up, Dirk. Good that you didn't jump over that slide in the way I'd suggested, because that's such a key information I wasn't aware of myself. And Steam is such a big platform for games. Yeah. It's real shame.
Well, yeah, I guess that's a little bit of politics too. PEGI originated because 20 years ago, there was a very strong push from authorities and governments to do something about video game content. From my perspective, I do get the feeling that Steam is hiding maybe a little bit. They are ultimately nothing but a website in Europe, but I would hope that at some point they are so big that they cannot evade their responsibility and also take some steps. And I'm getting indications that we may be getting there, but better late than not.
Okay. There's also this element of notoriety, I guess, that fits around it a little bit, isn't there? Is that, you know, for young people and adults alike, they kind of know if you want to get a certain type of game that's not going to fall under the sort of the PEGI ratings, Steam's the place to go. So I think there's that aspect as well that they probably play on.
The thing is, you need a PC for that, and unless parents have a PC for their children, consoles are a much more accessible way, and it's a safer way. So it's not easy to actually go on Steam with a laptop, yes, and so on. But let's hope
the thing is,
that improves.
I mean, in schools, probably there are more PCs than consoles, so
Correct.
I think it's really important information for teachers to be aware of. Okay, great. I think we need to close. We're already 10 minutes beyond, but I do quickly want to just flag up again. Make sure everyone to check out the PEGI website. It's also available in, I don't know how many languages, but a lot of different languages and a lot of resources there. And the same for the Better Internet for Kids portal. And we'll inform you via email, all the course participants, once this module that Gareth mentioned is also available there. I think that, as Gareth was saying, that's going to be launching soon. So that's also an additional resource. And of course, as mentioned, make sure to check out Module 5. There's a ton of important stuff being covered there by Ollie related to what Gareth and Dirk have been talking about. So yeah, and enjoy this last module. It's the last module of the course. Bear in mind, there's a deadline coming up. So you also have your final assessment due on the 31st of May. So please pay attention to that, and please make sure you follow through all the different steps, submit your lesson plan, and review 3 of your peers as part of that. And, you know, Gareth, myself, and all the team at the European Schoolhouse Academy are there to help in case of need, so don't hesitate to reach out. Yeah, many thanks for joining tonight. I think we should have really had a bit more time. Next time, I think we'll have to plan for a longer webinar or 2 webinars. A ton of stuff to cover, but huge thanks to both Gareth and Dirk for taking the time to join us tonight and to share all the different information and resources that they have. Yeah,
Ben, last thing, very, very quickly, because I always good for us to get it in very quickly. I know everyone's been working really hard through the course and absolutely fantastic, and I'm looking forward to seeing lots of people with their certificates soon. If you've got a spare 5-10 minutes, if you could take part in our Games in Schools survey about your experiences with using games in schools, that would be really, really helpful, because we want to collect as many different perspectives as we can. I've just popped the link into the chat again.
Okay, great. I was going to put it just on the screen again, but many thanks for reminding me about that. That's very important.
Great minds.
Indeed. It's also, the link is always in the emails that we send out. So really appreciate it if you, as Gareth was saying, if you could complete that still. It's going to help us out. Great. Well, many thanks, everyone. And I wish everyone a good rest of the evening and see you on the course. Goodbye.
Thanks so much. Goodbye.